when there's questions around, is this political, or, like what we're seeing now, Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, then there's the movement, then there's the organization and stuff like that. So what would you say, around that?
Yeah, I think it's a very frustrating question, right? Because it's like, why is my existence or the humanity and dignity and rights that are attributed to people of color a political conversation? Like, I think I saw something on Instagram the other day and it was like, so my humanity is up for debate? Like ending racism is up for debate? Like, how is that possible? And I think that paradigm undermines the work that has to be done. We've made this a political conversation in America, right? And all over the world, Australia, the UK, we've made this about political choice or party, right? Where somehow racial justice, racial equity is conflated with these other nuanced political platforms, right? This idea of pro-life, or this idea of gun access and gun control. And that is such a disservice to what we're trying to do, right? Unfortunately, in America and most of the Western world, these vertical areas of health, housing, policing, safety, all education, all those things cannot be separated. They are intricately and intrinsically connected to the conversation of racial oppression. And the outcomes of those vertical areas are based on those intersections. And so it can't continue to be a political conversation, because then it comes down to votes. It comes down to someone literally voting whether or not I, a Latinx community member, people a part of the Asian community, the indigenous community, get to have access to capital, housing, get to go to a quality school. It comes down to our votes rather than a paradigm shift. And so I say this in different contexts, that this is not a political conversation. This isn't even a conversation of morality. Like, this is a conversation of humanity. And whether or not we want to value people, whether we want to value communities. And so we need to really disrupt this notion that it's political. I think that is often the response to Black Lives Matter. I was having a conversation with my cousin. She's just graduated college, and unfortunately in the midst of COVID didn't get to graduate in the way that, all of us are used to celebrating. But she ended up having this pretty robust and difficult conversation within her sorority. She was trying to get folks to invest in the conversation of Black Lives Matter. And so many folks were like, oh, well, that doesn't align with my political agenda. And my parents wouldn't approve of this. And, I was in some ways really excited for her that this conversation was happening in that context, right? And that they were challenging one another. But what a disservice that those young people believe that by engaging in the conversation, right? Sometimes I like to flip it, because it's become such a slogan that I think some ways it's lost its, not its meaning, but the way we understand it, right? So rather than saying Black Lives Matter, that there are millions of young people across this world where their understanding of whether or not we should value Black life, because that's literally what it's saying, comes down to the fact their parents are Republicans, or their parents vote a certain way. Like, that is, if we think about that, how heartbreaking is that? That whether or not you value Black life, whether or not you believe that, Latinx family members should be in cages, whether or not we believe that Asian Americans and Asians around the world should be blamed for the coronavirus, like, all of those things are based on whether or not you vote red or blue, right? And so we really have to do, I think, as institutions, every institution, such as a museum, is really help to contextualize this conversation and this, what I hope is not a moment, right? I think we got really caught up in thinking about this as a moment, but as a momentum shift, as a paradigm shift, that what we're talking about is how do we value life? Right. And how do we as institutions want to take responsibility and accountability for the ways in which because I always say there's only two ways to operate as organization. You're either a part of maintaining systems of oppression or you're part of dismantling it. There's no neutrality, right? So the overwhelming feeling that we're seeing happen from so many brands and organizations and companies around the world, because they're like, how do we respond to this moment, right? From Nike to, Amazon to Hulu, right? Everyone came out with a statement, or everyone came out with an Instagram post about we value Black lives, or with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But that can only truly be tested or evaluated by the ways in which your practices, your policies, your internal ethos truly values Black life, not a well-written marketing campaign that only responds to this moment because it may impact your bottom line or your consumer base or your donor base. But how have you truly aligned the mission, vision, and practices of your internal operation and your external ethos to value Black life? That is not a stagnant position. And I think that is what has to shift. Like, it's not just about the statement you put on your website or your Instagram, right? But it is an active stance, which means you are constantly interrogating how that is being lived out in your organization, which is a little bit why I philosophically have shifted from this idea of allyship, which I think has become a more stagnant, stationary position, right? We are allies with this community, and we demonstrate that through this particular stance or statement versus co-agitation, which I think presents a more active stance. Like, how are you actively agitating, right, these normative practices or normative understandings to truly value not just Black life, but all communities, and particularly communities that have historically been marginalized or oppressed.